If I could sum that chapter up in a nutshell, it would be about putting others before ourselves. And I believe that's the essence of the gospel message. It is why Jesus came. Think about what he did when he gave up things that he rightly had a claim to. And he came to this earth, and you think about everything that he gave and gave up was not selfish. To be selfish is to be the opposite of everything Jesus is and what he stood for and what he did. And so when I think about that, Paul, in writing to the Philippians, that was his example. He didn't go to Philippi for himself. If you remember, actually, he wanted to go into Asia. And that was his plan, but the Spirit told him no. So then God told him to go over to Macedonia. When he went over to Macedonia, it wasn't to make it easy. He went to Macedonia to preach the gospel. And while he was there, he got put in jail. And while in jail, that's what led to the conversion of the jailer. That wasn't for Paul's benefit. That was for God and the jailer and his household's benefit. And then now Paul's in bonds again in another place, writing to the Philippians, and he's telling them, I'd rather go on and be with the Lord, which is far better, but to be with you is better for you. So Paul is thinking about people again. He's thinking about others more than himself. And with that in mind, in chapter 2, when he says, if there be, therefore, any consolation in Christ. In other words, if you get anything at all about God's message, if you understand the message of the gospel, even in its most basic foundational principle, it's not about ourselves. It's not about doing what I want. It's not about doing what's best for me. It's about doing what's best for others. And what motivates that should come from a place of love and concern for others. Having fellowship in the Spirit is caring about things that God cares about. Things that the Spirit cares about. Not on the earthly so much. Not on the material. Not on the physical. And then he talks about, the King James says, if any bowels and mercies. We don't typically talk like that. Your translations say, if there's any affection. But you think about the idea of where your seat of emotions are, and where do you feel that? Do you ever feel that in your stomach? Do you ever have this yearning for another person, that you feel what they feel? You try to understand what they're going through. Do you know, in order to do that, what I have to do is I have to try to put myself in their shoes. Which means I've got to try to sit where they sit. I've got to understand where they're coming from. That's what Jesus did. And if I understand that, His mercy for me, so I need to extend that to other people and be patient with other people. I need to exercise that mercy that He extended to me. And when Paul talks about his joy in verse 2, fulfill ye my joy. What is your joy? If someone could ask you, what is it that makes you the most happy? What would you say? I know what Paul is talking about here. His joy is not about his own little world and things that he likes. His joy is seeing souls come to Christ, and souls that have come to Christ continue to grow and be more like Christ. That's his joy. Seeing God's will accomplished. That is what makes him more happy than anything. That really ought to be our joy as well. And there ought to be joy among Christians. We ought to be the most joyous people on earth. And it ought to show. When people come in and see us, they ought to see a people who have a reason and a purpose. And they ought to see people who have a hope and have that among ourselves. And they ought to see that we love one another with the same love. And he says, being of one accord, of one mind. I like the word accord. And I think the root idea is if you think of a musical chord. I think it illustrates the idea of it. You know, you can sing one note on one pitch, and everybody can be in unison, but that's not the exact idea of a chord. A chord is when you have multiple notes, different pitches, but somehow those different pitches go together in a harmonious way. That's the idea of a chord. When you have multiple people, multiple personalities, multiple backgrounds, multiple cultures, multiple personal interests, we're all not the same. But isn't it beautiful? When people of all different backgrounds can have the unified purpose. It's not that we are all the same, but we all have a unified purpose. And the idea when he says having one mind. It's interesting. We all have different wills. I have things I like and dislike. I have my own set of pet peeves, I guess. It's things that bother me, things I like. But the one mind part means I've got to set aside my opinion. I've got to set aside the things I like and don't like. And I've got to think about what's best for the whole. And whenever we leave aside self, and we're exercising what's better for the whole of the group, that's coming of one mind. And then verse 3, he says, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. Some of yours will say selfish ambition. But in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. You know, there's a lot of things that people do that might be in the name of good. It might have an appearance of good. It might have that. Nobody would necessarily say that's a bad thing. But sometimes we do good things for the wrong reasons. Sometimes we may do good things for me. And I got to be careful about that. You got to be careful about that. Maybe a way to illustrate this is a ball team. It's a team sport. And I've played enough sports to know I would rather have average, mediocre players on a team who are playing as a team, to playing for each other, playing to win with the right attitude, than having a couple of star players who are all about breaking their own record, who are all about taking and getting the limelight for themselves. Because I tell you what's going to happen with that. That star player is going to lose the game for the whole team, because they're going to think about being a hero in their own place instead of thinking what's best for the whole. And I think the same thing can happen in a church. And we've got to guard against that. We all want to be involved. We should want to be involved in the work of the kingdom. We should all want to do things that please God. But in chapter 1, Paul mentioned that there are some who preach Christ for the wrong motive. He was glad that at least Christ's name was being promoted. But he is encouraging here, don't let it be out of some selfish reason. If I were to preach because I want you to praise me, that would be a very immature reason to preach. if I were to do anything, whether it's the public worship or whether it is for outside of that, but it's for the cause of Christ, if I do it for me because I'm trying to get praise to me, I might get that, Jesus said, but that's all you get. There's a reason why Jesus said when you pray, go into your closet. Or why when you give, you do that, you don't let your left hand know what your right hand does. Or when you fast, don't do it to be seen of men. We've got to be careful about doing what we do so I can get your praise and to look good. That's what happened with Ananias and Sapphira. They were doing a good thing, giving, but they lied about the amount they gave. Let's make sure our motive is for God's purpose. And he says, in lowliness of mind, let each esteem other better than themselves. I think usually we think too highly of ourselves. And we've got to be careful about that because that's, again, is the opposite of what Jesus did. Verse 4, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. A little while back, we had a visitor from Virginia. Some of you may remember him, but he was telling me he had a sibling who has been unfaithful for a good number of years. And he was really worried about his family member. And I asked him, I said, well, what caused the unfaithfulness? And he said, and it wasn't here, but where the person attended, an older sister, I believe, came into the assembly, walked up to this man's sibling, and said, you're in my seat. And that offended that sibling of his. She stopped attending for a good number of years. We need to think about our words. We need to think about what we do, what we say. Is it about me and my seat? Is it about me and what I want? Is it about what I'm used to? Here's my familiarity. Here's my comfort zone, so I'm thinking about me. And you would think that an older person should know better. You would think that one who has been in the faith for a while would know. And so we need to think about others. How does this look to them? How do I know where they're coming from? Think of others before self. And then, verse 5, he gives the best example of thinking of others before self. Verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. I'm thinking about, why would Jesus even come to the earth? And what would that cost him? What prompted him? What motivated him to want to come here? To come to a world full of sin, full of people who had rejected him, full of people who had been ignoring him, been ignoring the prophets, and been ignoring the pleas. Why then take the step to then leave your heavenly home, your heavenly form? I can't even wrap my head around all of what that must mean for God to send his Son and Jesus to leave his glorified form. I don't even know what that is. We're given some descriptions, but we're not allowed to even see it. So I don't think we even really comprehend how much he gave up to take upon our form. How low did he have to go? How much did he have to stoop and humble himself to come and to walk in our skin, to feel what we feel? And when he came, he didn't take the best home. He didn't take the best area. He wasn't born in the most notable area. He wasn't born in the wealthiest family. He became poor, that we might be rich. Why did he do that? And why did he come into a world full of darkness and full of sin? And have those humble circumstances, knowing that there would be some who would not appreciate what he did. He put our needs before his own. That's what it's all about, is thinking of us above himself. He was the most and is the most unselfish of all of us. He was made in our likeness. The Hebrew writer says that God said to the angels, "Let all the angels worship him," his Son. His Son is higher than all of the angels, and yet he made himself lower than the angels. How much lower am I willing to put myself? And am I willing to put myself in others' shoes? I think, generally speaking, most of us humans are not very good at putting ourselves in others' shoes. We're not very good at understanding where a person is coming from. We don't always know. Sometimes we act like we do, and maybe we like to think that we do, but I don't think we're generally good at that. I think we need to try. I think we need to try harder to empathize, to try to seek to understand. Why is that person that bothers me the way they are? Do I know everything about their circumstance? Do I know? And I think about what our purpose is as a church and what Paul is telling the Philippians and how that might relate to us. And I was thinking about an illustration. Some of you may know more about the Titanic sinking than I do, but I was looking up some facts and figures about that. And I think it makes a point. Did you know that the Titanic was equipped to carry 64 lifeboats, which would have held a good number more than what was actually on the Titanic? But instead of carrying the 64 lifeboats, there were only 20 on the Titanic. And the reason why they only had 20 was for cosmetic reasons. It was because it would make the decks not look as appealing from the outside when you saw it from the harbor. So it doesn't look as good, seeing that many lifeboats on it. I think I could make an illustration with that, can't you? But also, of the 20 lifeboats that was on the Titanic, they only filled them to about half capacity. So there could have been many more people saved than were saved. Maybe they didn't think that the boat would sink. There were some, and there was even one comment that was said to say, even God cannot sink this ship. Well, unsinkable ships do sink. Did you know that there was one lifeboat that while it had the capacity to hold 65 people on that one boat, that only 12 actually were lowered on that lifeboat? And there's that boat has been called the millionaire's boat by the press. And the reason why was because there were wealthy people from the first class that was on that boat, and there were poor people who were not on the boat. And also on that, compared to all boats, if you had been in first class on the Titanic, your likelihood of survival was a lot greater. But if you had been in the third class, your likelihood of survival was not that great. Now, some of that was because the third class was lower, but some of that was due to the fact that they were regarded as less valuable by some. There were gates that were locked in the lower class. And so that was a problem. There were also the fact that in the lifeboats, some did not even come back to try to get more passengers after the lifeboats were emptied. Out of all of the lifeboats that were filled, and they weren't filled, only one returned to try to get more passengers. And one man commented, he was a Titanic survivor. His name is Jack B. Thayer, and this is what he said. The partly filled lifeboat, standing by about 100 yards away, never came back. Why on earth they never came back is a mystery. How could any human being fail to heed those cries? There were some reports, and I don't know if this is fully true or if it's rumored, but there were some who were crying from the water, asking some in the boats to please help them, and they ignored their cries. Because maybe they were afraid they would come over to the boat, capsize the whole boat. There was some fear of that. There was some fear of not returning to get others because of the overwhelming of that, or that the ship, when it would sink, that would cause a suction and bring them down in it. But I also do wonder if attitudes could have been different, if there was less complacency about how to handle the regarding of life, if there was a higher regard for life and less for self, could there have been more people saved? I have to wonder that. And I think about that. I'm trying to make some application here about the whole purpose of Jesus coming to the earth was not just to save physical life. Now, he did go about doing good, and he saw people with ailments and sicknesses and disease. And he did save lives, and he raised the dead. But the reason he did those things is not only because he cared, but also because he wanted to save their spiritual lives. And the fact that he can do that physically shows that he is able to. And I remember one occasion where Jesus was angry. And the reason why he was angry was because there was a man who was paralyzed. And that man needed healing. And what some were upset about is, oh no, he's going to heal that man on the Sabbath day. How much you want to bet? He's going to do it. He's about to heal him on the Sabbath day. And they were more concerned about that and even misunderstanding what the Sabbath was for, that they had a hardness of heart. That here is a man who was paralyzed. No concern for the man. No concern, no compassion for the man. Come back tomorrow and heal him, is what they said. No wonder Jesus was angry at the hardness of their heart, that they cared more about that than the man himself. What if that had been them? Imagine you were the man who was paralyzed. Would you not want to be healed? What if that man had been your brother or your dad or your son? What if you were the one who were taking care of him? And now here's the opportunity. You're the one that has seen all of the inconveniences he's had to go through. And yet, they were hard in their heart towards that man. And they were angry at Jesus because he cared for the man. Let's think of others more than ourselves. Let's have compassion. Let's be a people who are known to be selfless. And let's known to be people who serve others. Because Jesus is higher than anyone. His name is above all others. And everybody will bow one day. But yet he humbled himself. He himself knelt to write in the sand once. He himself knelt to wash disciples' feet. He himself gave up his own bed. He himself gave up his comforts. He himself gave up his spot. I think I could give up a seat. If I'm sitting somewhere and there's somebody else sitting beside, I think it'd be okay for me to give up my seat. I think if there's someone coming in the door, I think I can open the door for them. I think if there is someone else who needs help carrying a load, I think it ought to be a part of our nature to just naturally want to lend a hand. And be of service. And so in verse 14, he says, do all things without murmurings and disputings. I think about how would this relate? In the process of worshiping God and the process of doing God's will, it can be that we can be focused on earthly things, just like the Israelites of old in the wilderness. Here it was, they were saved out of slavery, and what they began to do is think about the food. and they thought about the things that they were familiar with back in Egypt. And they were thinking about, well, what about me? And I want to be able to have a say instead of Moses. And they began to think about those kinds of things. So silly. And yet what they were not doing was being thankful that God had saved them out of the beatings. And God was thankful for, or that they were thankful for what God had done for them and giving them this law and making them a special people and raising them to a higher standard and teaching them how to treat one another and giving them a special place in the history of mankind, and ushering in the Messiah. Let's not be like that. Let's learn from the Israelites' mistakes and the grumblings and the disputings. God never liked that. Never has. He never will. And so the next time I want to complain about some silly little thing that doesn't matter, some petty little thing that really should not matter over the overall scheme of things, let's think about what's most important. Let's think about souls, and let's think about what we can do to further God's kingdom. Paul goes on to talk about people who are examples in that as well as Jesus. Timothy's got it. Epaphroditus has got it. Timothy is different. He says, he is like me. I have nobody else like-minded like Timothy. And here's Paul, who knew a lot of people. He knew a lot of brethren. And yet he could single this young man out and say, everybody else thinks of themselves, but Timothy, he gets it. He is not thinking of himself. He thinks of others. And here's Epaphroditus. He's not thinking of himself. He was sick, and yet he's trying to give service to Paul. And he's risking his life, and he's risking himself of visiting Paul and associating himself with Paul. In the wake of him also having needs of his own, but yet he gives that up, puts himself in harm's way in order to care for Paul. And so these are the kinds of examples that Paul is giving us to learn from. Let's put these kinds of things in practice. Let's think of others before ourselves. What does it even mean to be a Christian? If not to care about lost souls? If I am a Christian, that's a wonderful privilege to call myself that name. That's a worthy name by which we're called. But what does that mean for me, though? It means I've got to care about evangelism like the Lord did. If I don't care about reaching the lost, then I am not a Christian. Anybody who does not care and have a yearning, burning heart for all the lost souls is not a Christian, because that is what it means to be a Christian, is that's what Jesus did. I have to care about souls. If you're a Christian, care about souls and reach out and do what you can. Spread the word. There's a message of a good news that salvation is available. Forgiveness is available. That you can have a hope in heaven. And I think we of all people, we should want to share that more than anybody else. I should be involved in it in some way, somehow. Not everybody necessarily does the same job. Not everybody has the same role in sharing that gospel. But I would want to be involved. I would want to be a team player in helping in that. If you're not a Christian, come into the lifeboat that God has given you. Come into the faith in the family of God. There is a rescue that is needed, and that is, without that, there's eternal loss away from the presence of God. Why not believe that Jesus is the Christ? Why not turn from your wicked way? If you're unwilling to repent, you're going to all likewise perish, we're told. Which means you've got to be willing to give up the things or anything that God does not want. But if you're willing to confess, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, and you're willing to be baptized, every sin that you have committed can be washed away as if it's never committed. That's a beautiful message of forgiveness that's available to all. And the good news is, it's not that there's only so many lifeboats. It is not that there's only so many that can enter in. Jesus told in the story to go out and invite, and some would make excuse, but then he said, go out and invite more. Go out into the highways and the hedges and compel them to come in. That message of the gospel is what we need to be about if we're a Christian. And he said, and yet there is room. It is not that we have, like, okay, we're so full here. No more. Let's deal with the ones we've got. No, let's compel as many and fill God's house with as many as we can reach. Whatever your need is, won't you come while we stand and as we sing.